Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The dense forest loomed ahead, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels in the heavy mist that curled around their trunks. It was the kind of forest that had been untouched for centuries, its paths worn smooth by countless footsteps, yet never quite free of the whispers of old folklore that warned of its hidden dangers. The 5 of them stood at the edge, their backpacks weighed down with supplies, their boots still dry from the early morning dew. The air had the familiar scent of earth, wet moss and pine, unmistakably fresh but heavy with the promise of a coming storm. The group had been planning this trip for months, experienced hikers, each of them familiar with the natural world's harshest conditions. They had no fear of a little rain. After all, it was supposed to be nothing more than a light shower, a brief inconvenience that would pass before long. The forecast had assured them of clear skies after midday. Yet, as they stood there at the trailhead, something about the woods unsettled them. Perhaps it was the thickening clouds, the darkening sky, or the unnatural silence that seemed to hang in the air like an omen. "Feels like it's holding its breath," Sarah said, glancing up at the sky, her voice tinged with an unspoken apprehension. "Just a little rain," Alex replied, attempting to brush off the tension in his tone. "We've hiked through worse." They exchanged nods of agreement, each of them eager to begin. The heavy backpacks shifted as they adjusted their gear, and one by one they stepped into the forest's cool embrace. The path was narrow but well marked, cutting through thick underbrush and towering pines, their boughs swaying gently in the wind that had begun to stir. Birds cawed faintly in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves told of small creatures darting in the shadows. The rain had barely begun, a soft patter against the leaves as the hikers made their way deeper into the forest. The rhythmic sound of it on the trees above was soothing, almost hypnotic. They moved with purpose, their steps synchronized, the crunch of the trail underfoot marking their steady progress. But as the minutes passed, the air began to thicken. The once gentle breeze turned biting, and the drizzle intensified into a steady stream of droplets. "We'll stop for lunch soon," said Ben, the most pragmatic of the group. He kept a sharp eye on the trail, adjusting his map every so often, even though he had hiked this route before. His voice was calm, but his lips were pressed tightly together, betraying a subtle concern. As the rain poured harder, the trail became slick, mud beginning to creep across their path. Water gathered in small pools, threatening to swallow the narrow track. Still, they pressed on, the storm's weight settling over them like a thick fog, closing in from all sides. It was no longer a simple hike. The atmosphere had shifted, turning the once familiar forest into something more ominous, its edges blurred in the mist. Sarah wiped a strand of wet hair from her face, squinting against the rain. "I don't remember this part of the trail," she murmured, looking around. "We should have hit the river by now, shouldn't we?" Ben paused, frowning. He looked at the map again, then at the surrounding trees. "We're on track," he assured them, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Just a little disorienting with the rain. But Sarah was right. Something didn't feel right. The trail they had been following seemed to curve in an unexpected direction, and the once clear path had become muddled in the downpour, each turn indistinguishable from the last. The familiar landmarks they had been counting on, old fallen logs, large rocks, had all disappeared beneath the veil of rain. "Let's take a quick break," Alex suggested, glancing over at Sarah, his concern mirrored in her eyes. They were all feeling it, the weight of the storm, the sense of being swallowed by the forest. They gathered under a thick canopy of trees, taking refuge as best they could. The wind howled through the branches, making it difficult to hear anything beyond the constant drumming of the rain. The forest felt suffocating, the shadows stretching, longer than they should have, the air thick and damp. The world had turned into a wash of grey and green, each tree indistinguishable from the next. "I swear the rain wasn't supposed to be this bad," Sarah said, her voice tinged with unease. "This is more than what was forecasted. It's just a storm," Ben replied, though his tone was less certain now. He glanced around, as if expecting to see something that wasn't there. "You know how quickly things can change in the forest," Alex said, trying to reassure the group. "We'll get through it." They ate in silence for a few moments, the food in their packs a faint comfort in the oppressive atmosphere. The rain continued to pour, each droplet adding to the relentless cacophony that surrounded them. Every now and then, a distant crack of thunder made the forest tremble, shaking loose a shower of rain from the trees above. When they finally decided to press on, the trail had already become nearly impassable. The mud had thickened, turning the ground into a slippery quagmire. Ben led the way, his brow furrowed as he tried to keep track of their position, but it was growing increasingly difficult to see where they had been, let alone where they were going. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, her voice shaking slightly. She looked behind them, but the path they had come from seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the rain. There was no sign of the trail, only the same endless line of trees, their trunks blurred by the heavy downpour. "No," Ben said firmly. "We've come too far to turn back now. Let's just keep going. We'll find a shelter soon." But as they moved forward, a strange sensation began to creep over them, like the very forest was shifting around them. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out as if to grasp them. The ground beneath their feet became more unstable, each step a risk. The wind howled louder now, cutting through their clothing, leaving them chilled to the bone. Then, as if on cue, the rain began to intensify again, and in the distance, the sound of something else, something unnatural, began to rise above the storm. It was a soft sound at first, faint and distant, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing moment, like the snap of a twig. Then another, and another. The sounds were coming from all directions. At first they thought it was the wind, or perhaps the forest itself, shifting under the weight of the rain. But as the sounds grew closer, clearer, it became undeniable. There was something moving through the forest with them, something that was not the wind, not the storm. And it was getting closer. The rain turned from a nuisance to a threat, its incessant pounding drowning out any other sound. The forest, once so familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, hostile. The noise was suffocating, a constant, unrelenting roar that seeped into their minds like a poison, distorting their thoughts. Every branch that creaked in the wind, every rustling leaf, now sounded like an omen. The trail was disappearing under layers of rain-soaked earth, and with it, their sense of security. Ben, usually the calm, rational leader, was visibly shaken. His hand gripped the map tightly, his fingers trembling as he traced the trail with a sense of urgency. But no matter how many times he checked, the path seemed to shift, the landmarks growing more elusive by the second. He'd been here before, on this very trail, but now the forest felt like a labyrinth, a living, breathing thing that had grown hostile, twisting its paths as if it were deliberately trying to disorient them. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, over the rain's roar. She huddled closer to Ben, her eyes wide with a growing unease. "We're not going to make it through this storm. It's too much." "We can't stop," Ben replied, his voice tight. "We keep going and we'll find shelter. The rain will pass. We just have to push through." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. The rain wasn't letting up. It wasn't a passing storm. It was a deluge, and the forest was changing around them. As they moved forward, the sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rain. Something was moving in the forest with them. Something deliberate. "Did you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice strained. His eyes darted around as if searching for the source of the noise. "Probably just the wind," Ben said, though the words sounded hollow. He wasn't so sure anymore. The wind didn't sound like that. It wasn't a random rustling. It was purposeful. It was close. Too close. The path had turned treacherous. The trail was slick with mud, and each step felt like it might be their last, the ground shifting beneath them like quicksand. The trees towered overhead, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out any sense of direction. They were in the belly of the storm now, and the forest had become an alien world. Nothing looked the same, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ben's breath came faster as he glanced over his shoulder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He knew what he was hearing. There was something following them, a presence just out of sight. The wind was carrying it, the rhythmic tapping that didn't match the storm's chaos. It was a sound like footsteps, dragging steps, someone, or something, moving through the underbrush with purpose. It was following them. "Stay close," Ben ordered, trying to steady his voice. His eyes scanned the dark shadows between the trees, every movement in the distance now suspicious. His senses were on high alert, his body primed for danger. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, but when he turned his head, he saw nothing. Just the relentless rain, the mist, the trees. They moved faster, the feeling of being hunted, growing stronger with each passing minute. Alex was the first to see something, an old, dilapidated shelter, barely standing against the storm. It was a crude structure, constructed from broken branches and torn tarps, its edges sagging under the weight of the rain. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it, as if it had been left in a hurry. The sight of it made their blood run cold. "We shouldn't stop," Sarah said urgently, her voice shaking. "It could be a trap." But Ben, despite his fear, knew they needed shelter. They couldn't keep walking through this storm, and the shelter, whatever its origins, was better than nothing. They hurried toward it, their feet slipping in the mud, their bodies cold and numb from the rain. As they reached the shelter, Ben ducked inside, the others following quickly. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of rotting wood and wet earth. It was a poor refuge, but it would do. As they huddled inside, the storm raged outside, the sound of it so deafening they could barely hear each other speak. The shelter creaked and groaned under the pressure, its walls shaking with the fury of the wind. But it offered a strange kind of safety, a false sense of security. "It's just the storm," Ben muttered, though he wasn't convinced. He had been here long enough to know that a storm like this didn't just happen. This was no ordinary weather. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against them. Alex knelt by the entrance, peering out into the rain-soaked darkness. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low. "There's someone out there. I can feel it." "Stop," Ben snapped. "It's just the storm playing tricks on you." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The noises, those dragging footsteps, were still there, but now they were louder, more distinct. Someone, or something, was out there, watching them. A sudden crash outside made them all jump. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his body rigid with tension. "What was that?" he hissed, his voice tight with fear. "I don't." "No," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she glanced around the shelter. "But it's getting closer." The sound of the footsteps was unmistakable now. There was no mistaking it. They were coming closer. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself was pressing in on them. The walls of the shelter seemed to shrink, the shadows inside growing longer and more sinister. The storm was no longer the enemy. It was the thing hiding in the shadows, the thing they could not see. It was coming for them, and then a voice, a low, raspy whisper, slithered through the darkness. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew clearer with each passing second. The words were not in any language they recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. They weren't alone in the forest, and whatever was out there, it was not human. Ben's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The forest had always been a place of wonder for him, a place where nature's beauty reigned. But this, the wet, suffocating atmosphere, the strange symbols carved into the trees, the dragging footsteps, this was not nature. This was something darker, something old. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The storm, too, seemed to quiet, as if taking a breath before the next round of chaos. The silence was worse than the storm. The silence that followed the eerie whisper was thick, suffocating, and for a long moment, no one dared to move. The storm, though still raging outside, had become distant, a dull thrum in the background of the unnatural quiet that had fallen upon the shelter. They sat huddled in the darkness, only the sound of their own breaths breaking the tension. The trees, the wind, the rain, everything had been drowned out by that one chilling moment. The voice, or whatever it had been, had shaken them to their core. Ben's fingers gripped the edge of his pack so tightly that his knuckles were white. He had heard it too, the whisper. It hadn't been the wind, nor had it been the storm. It had come from somewhere just outside the shelter, as if it had slipped through the cracks of the walls and wrapped itself around their minds. And it wasn't just the whisper itself that was terrifying. It was the feeling that it had been waiting for them, that it knew them, that they had wandered into something much older and more malicious than any storm. Did anyone else hear that? Alex asked, his voice a shaky whisper, almost afraid to break the stillness. I heard it, Ben replied hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. It wasn't the storm. Sarah looked around at the others, her eyes wide with panic. We're not alone here, she said, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Now. We can't leave, Ben snapped, though he knew deep down that they might not be able to escape the forest even if they tried. The rain was still falling in torrents outside, turning the ground into an impassable mire. And even if they could somehow make it back to the trail, they were lost. They had no idea where they were anymore. The storm had swallowed up the world, they knew, leaving them stranded in this hostile alien landscape. Ben's right, Alex said, his voice shaking. We need to stay put for now. If we leave, we'll just get more lost. A heavy, oppressive feeling settled in the shelter, a sense of being trapped, not just by the storm, but by something more, something darker. They couldn't see what was out there, but they could feel it. The forest was alive with something that wasn't natural. The sounds of footsteps, of rustling leaves, the subtle creaks of branches swaying in the wind. All of it felt too deliberate, too intentional. I don't think we should wait any longer, Sarah insisted, her eyes darting around the shelter. We don't know what's out there, but I know one thing, we shouldn't stay here. But Ben wasn't so sure. As much as he wanted to leave, there was a gnawing fear deep inside him that told him the forest had already closed in on them. It had been following them, watching them. The shelter, crumbling and makeshift as it was, might be the only thing, keeping them from whatever was out there. Sarah, he said, his voice soft but firm. We need to stay calm. We don't know what's happening, but running blindly into that storm will only make it worse. We'll wait until the storm lets up, and then we'll figure out what to do. but Sarah was already standing, moving to the entrance of the shelter. "We can't just sit here and do nothing," she said, almost pleading. Her hands trembled as she pushed aside the ragged tarp that covered the shelter's entrance. She peered out into the rain-soaked darkness, her breath fogging up in the cold air. Her eyes darted around, scanning the forest, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life, just the endless pounding rain. Then something caught her eye, a shape, barely visible through the thick veil of rain, standing at the edge of the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was there, watching her. It didn't move, didn't react to her presence. It simply stood there, unmoving, like a shadow. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Ben moved quickly to her side, his heart pounding. He peered out into the rain, but all he saw was the same unbroken stretch of trees and mist. There was nothing out there. Nothing. "Sarah, you're imagining things," he said, trying to steady his voice, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. "It's just the storm playing tricks on you." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She backed away from the entrance slowly, her eyes never leaving the place where the figure had stood. She sank back into the shelter, her hands pressed against her chest as if trying to calm her racing heart. "I saw it," she whispered. "I know what I saw." The group fell silent once again. The storm outside continued to rage, but now there was something else. Something more terrifying than the rain, more suffocating than the thunder. The forest felt alive with an oppressive, malevolent presence, as if it were breathing, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Then suddenly the noise returned. The footsteps. Soft at first, barely audible over the storm, but growing louder, closer. Ben's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted to the others, their faces pale and stricken with fear. There was no mistaking it. The sound was unmistakable. The dragging, scraping steps of something or someone moving through the underbrush, its presence growing closer by the second. "It's coming closer," Alex said, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Ben said, his mind racing, "but we need to stay quiet. We can't let it know we're here." They held their breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped suddenly, the silence stretching. Taut. No sound, no movement. It was as if the forest had swallowed the thing whole. Ben felt his stomach twist. The air had grown even thicker, almost suffocating, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He glanced over at Sarah, who was trembling, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide with terror, and he could see the raw fear in them. She wasn't imagining things. Then, as quickly as it had stopped, the footsteps started again. This time, they were different. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. There was a rhythmic tapping now, a sharp, uneven pattern that echoed through the shelter like a hammer against the walls of their fragile refuge. It wasn't the sound of something walking, it was the sound of something dragging, scraping its way closer, almost methodical, as if it were counting down the seconds until it would reach them. And then, without warning, there was a loud crash outside the shelter, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone scraping against the walls, clawing at the shelter's fragile structure. The shelter shook. Ben felt his heart stop. The creature, whatever it was at the door. The sound, scraping, slow and deliberate, moved along the outside wall, the way fingernails might drag across wet canvas. The four of them froze in place, as if even the faintest breath might draw attention. It was no longer just fear in the shelter. It was dread. A silent, collective understanding had settled over them. Something was out there. Something that knew they were inside. The storm howled above them, but inside the shelter, it was unbearably quiet. The fire they had tried to start had failed. The cold was seeping into their bones. But none of them cared about the cold anymore. Not after that sound. Ben pressed himself against the far wall, sweat mingling with the rain that still clung to his skin. Every instinct screamed for movement, for escape, but where would they go? The storm outside had turned the forest into a black sea of rain, and they were already lost. Running would only deepen their isolation. Alex mouthed a single word: trap. And in his eyes, Ben saw it too. The shelter hadn't just been a refuge, it had been bait, left behind like a carcass in a snare, reeking of recent human use. But no one had come forward to reclaim it. No one ever would. Outside, the footsteps resumed, but not away, around. It circled the shelter slowly, a predator feeling its way around the edge of the kill. Sarah clasped her hands together, whispering, under her breath, a prayer or a mantra, something ancient and shaking. Her lips moved faster with each step that passed, as though her words could will it away. But nothing stopped the sound. Ben peeked through a gap in the warped wooden wall, just wide enough to see a sliver of the outside world. Something moved, in the trees. A shape, not clearly human but not entirely animal either, drifted between the trunks. It was too tall, its limbs too long, too slow in motion. Its presence didn't ripple through the brush like a person's would. It glided, almost as if the forest bent around it. He blinked, and it was gone. He backed away, hand over his mouth. "It's not a person," he mouthed. Then a hand, pale and slick, slapped against the outside of the tarp that served as a makeshift door. They screamed. Alex fell back into the wall, knocking over his pack. A metal tin rolled out and clattered to the ground, loud, too loud against the floor. The hand didn't move. It remained there, pressed against the shelter's entrance, the fingers long and wrong, too many knuckles, too little motion. Ben reached for his flashlight, turned it on. The beam flickered once, dim through the tarp. The hand twitched, and then slid slowly down the fabric, leaving behind streaks of black. Not mud. Ash? The streaks sizzled faintly, smoke curling from the cloth where it had been touched. The rain should have washed it away. It didn't. "What the fuck is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. No one answered. No one could. The thing moved away again, and for a long stretch, there was nothing. Only the sound of the rain. But the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. The forest had gone still. Even the storm seemed to pull back, as if the world were listening. And then, from somewhere deep in the trees, came a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a low, rhythmic chant. The words were unintelligible, spoken in a tongue that twisted in the mind and refused to be remembered. Yet each syllable scraped against their nerves like blades. It was neither male nor female, neither human nor beast. It echoed, as if the trees themselves repeated the phrases, mimicking it like a chorus of shadows. Sarah started sobbing, curling into herself. "It's in my head," she whispered. "It's in my head." Ben looked at her, horrified. "What is?" The voice. Ben didn't answer her. He couldn't, because as she said it, he began to hear it too. Not just outside anymore. Inside. Inside the shelter. Inside his own mind. It spoke behind his thoughts, twisting familiar memories into broken things. He saw his father's face, remembered the funeral he'd never wanted to attend. Except now the coffin had been empty. The memories were being played with, bent, frayed at the edges. He staggered back, bumping into Alex, who also looked like he was about to vomit. "Is this real?" Alex asked, barely coherent. "I don't know," Ben said. But he did. He just didn't want to say it. They couldn't stay. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound to the forest like an animal. It didn't hunt by scent or sound. It hunted by memory. It followed the trail of pain, of grief. Ben remembered the things Sarah had said when they first started the hike, that this place felt like it was holding its breath. Now, it was exhaling. He grabbed his bag. "We have to move. Now," Alex blinked, dazed. "Move where? We're lost." We follow the slope downhill. Water flows to rivers. Rivers lead to roads. It was a desperate plan, but better than staying in a cage waiting to be picked apart. Sarah needed help walking. She was still murmuring, her eyes darting around, not really seeing them anymore. Ben hoisted her arm over his shoulder. They exited the shelter in single file, stepping out into the blackened forest. The storm swallowed them immediately, soaking, deafening, unrelenting. But after what had happened inside, the storm almost felt safe. Then Alex stopped. "Wait." He pointed at the trees ahead. A tree, massive and ancient, stood in their path. Its bark peeled in long, vertical gashes, as if something had clawed its way up or down, and carved into its trunk, etched deep through years of moss and decay, were symbols, not markings, not graffiti, runes, sharp, repetitive, ritualistic. They pulsed faintly with a red glow despite the darkness, almost like veins beneath the bark. Ben stepped forward, staring at them. "I've seen these before," he said slowly. "A dream, from when I was a kid." "What do they mean?" Alex asked, voice tight. But Ben wasn't listening anymore. The air around the tree was warmer. The rain didn't touch the ground here. It slid off some invisible barrier. Sarah began weeping again. "I dreamed this tree," Ben whispered. "My father was hanging from it." He stepped closer. Alex grabbed him. "Don't." Ben froze. From the darkness beyond the tree, a shape emerged, not human, not completely. Its body was long and wet, black like drowned wood. Its head was tilted, curious. Its limbs were wrong. It didn't step. It floated, toes, grazing the ground. It did not belong here. It had never belonged here. It had been waiting, and now it had found them. The rain bent away from the tree. It didn't fall. It recoiled, cascading around the trunk like water flowing down the side of a dome. The air was unnaturally warm near the runes, and it smelled of iron and rot. Not the sweet, clean decay of wet earth, but something older, sour, like dried blood on stones left to bake in the sun. Ben stared into the pulsing red symbols carved deep into the bark. They didn't just glow. They throbbed like a heartbeat, one not aligned to his own. He could feel it echoing in his bones, slow and heavy, and still the thing stood there beyond the tree, unmoving, watching. Its limbs were too long, joints that bent the wrong way. Its skin, or the suggestion of it, was soaked, black, glistening with a shine that wasn't water. It had no face, just a long, stretched countenance, too smooth, too blank, like wet cloth draped over a skull. But where eyes should have been, the shadows pulsed, hungry and deep. No one moved. Not even the wind dared stir. Ben's voice came out in a whisper, hoarse and choked. "We need to move. Don't run. Don't speak. Just follow me." Sarah clutched his arm like a lifeline, trembling. Her eyes locked on the tree as though it might speak to her. Alex was behind, pale and stiff, his mouth working silently, lips forming words he wasn't saying aloud. The forest around them had changed again. The trail behind them no longer existed, replaced by twisted bramble, unnaturally black and veined with that same pulsing red light. The forest didn't just lose its path, it shifted it, like the woods were a labyrinth, and the pieces were being moved as they walked. They veered left of the tree, skirting the radius where the rain refused to fall. The moment they crossed beyond the runes, a loud crack echoed behind them, like a branch snapping. A warning. They didn't look back. Ben led them deeper into the thick woods. But he was no longer following a map or trail. He was following instinct, something primal, a sense that forward was the only direction that didn't end in madness. Every few steps, he checked over his shoulder. Nothing. But the silence followed them like a shadow. The further they moved, the stranger the forest became. Moss coated everything. Trees were bent in impossible arcs. Some leaned together, their trunks braided as though shaped by some ancient hand. The ground was wet but gave no sound underfoot, like walking on flesh. And the air, it buzzed, not with insects, but with soundless vibration. And then the symbols began appearing again, carved into trees, in groups. First 3 runes on a birch, then 5 on a broken stump, always in red, always pulsing, always watching. Sarah began to hum under her breath. A soft, tuneless sound. It was the only thing that tethered her, the only thing keeping her from sliding into the same silent madness that had begun to infect the others. Her humming grew faster the deeper they went. At last, they stumbled upon another clearing, this one wider, choked in mist, but with something new. A ring of stones, each, one waist-high, arranged in perfect symmetry, weathered, marked, etched with the same red runes. But in the center of the ring, a totem, a crude figure of wood and bone soaked in blackened resin. Antlers curved skyward, skulls, small ones, hung from rope around its neck. It stank of old fire and meat. Sarah let out a soft gasp. Ben approached. It slowly, unable to look away, the totem pulsed, not the light but the air around it, like it was drawing in the atmosphere, tugging reality inward. "Don't touch it," Alex warned, his voice hoarse. "I won't," Ben said. But he was lying. Something inside him needed to understand, needed to feel it. He reached forward, and the moment his fingers grazed the rough wood, a jolt coursed through him. Not pain, not heat, something worse, memory, but not his. He saw a man, shirtless, barefoot, his skin carved with those same runes, kneeling in the mud. The rain was falling, but it never touched him. Around him were others, faces hidden by bark masks, their hands raised as they chanted in unison. And then, a shape rose behind the kneeling man, the same thing Ben had seen by the tree. But it was clearer now, more present. It moved with the inevitability of a tide. One clawed hand extended. The kneeling man didn't flinch. The creature didn't kill him. It merged with him. Ben screamed and pulled his hand away. Fell back, coughing. His eyes were wide, streaming tears. "What did you see?" Alex asked. "They call it." Ben's voice was thin, hollow. "They call it here. Through pain, through grief." Sarah was humming again, louder now. "No one survives," she said softly. "They just become part of the forest." Ben looked up sharply. "What did you say?" Sarah blinked, dazed. "I didn't say anything." But she had. Her mouth hadn't moved, but they'd heard her, inside their minds. Ben stared at the totem. "This is a place of binding. They trapped it here." Alex's voice cracked. "Or fed it." A branch snapped somewhere nearby. All 3 of them turned. At the edge of the mist, standing just outside the ring of stones, was a man, soaked, shaking, barefoot. His clothes torn, face hidden beneath a hood-soaked black. But he wasn't moving, just standing, watching. Ben stepped forward. "Hello?" he called. The man didn't answer. Ben took a cautious step closer, mist parting slightly. The figure remained. Then the man lifted his head. It wasn't a man. Its face was missing, a smooth, empty canvas of wet skin. But as it tilted its head, the faintest slits opened where a mouth should be, and from within came a sound, a child's voice echoing out of the creature's mouthless face. "Ben." Ben staggered back. It was his brother's voice, the one who had died 10 years ago, drowned in a river near their childhood home. "No," Ben whispered, shaking. "You're not him." The thing stepped closer, head cocked. It spoke again. His brother's laugh this time. Familiar, wrong, and behind it, more shadows. Figures emerging from the fog, each stepping soundlessly into the circle's edge. None crossed it, but each had a face Ben recognized. People they'd lost. Alex gasped. "That's my grandmother. She died last year," Sarah whispered. "My daughter." But none of them moved into the circle. None of them reached out. They just watched. And then, all at once, the whispering returned. The language that scraped across their minds. The totem began to shake. Ben grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to destroy it." "It's a prison," Alex said. "What if breaking it lets it out?" Ben looked at him, eyes wild. "What if it's already loose?" And then the figures around them stepped closer, just 1 foot more, a single inch into the ring. The totem began to crack. Something was waking. The totem cracked again, this time louder. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. He felt the pressure in the air, like the entire forest was inhaling, preparing to exhale all at once. His hands trembled, and for a fleeting moment, he considered running, just leaving no matter where it took them. But even as the thought crossed his mind, something told him that there was no escaping this. Not anymore. The forest had already claimed them. Sarah's hand tightened around his arm, pulling him back. Her face was pale, her lips moving as if to form words that wouldn't come. But the expression on her face spoke volumes. Something was about to happen, and they had no control over it. "Ben," Alex's voice cracked through the tension. "We need to stop this. We have to do something. Now." Ben didn't need to look at Alex to know what he meant. They were on the edge of something ancient and unstoppable. Every step they'd taken had led them to this moment. And the figures that emerged from the fog, they weren't just watching, they were waiting for something. For them. One by one, the figures, the lost, the missing, the dead, stepped closer to the edge of the stone circle, their faces like masks of memories long buried. But the more they moved, the more the totem seemed to shudder. The cracks deepened, and the mist around them swirled like something living, coiling and twisting with intention. Then, the child's voice spoke again, this time from the faceless thing. "Ben." It wasn't a whisper. It was his brother's voice, clear, too familiar, like it was coming from the deepest corner of his mind. The figure's eyes, absent of sight, locked onto him, and for a moment, Ben felt himself drowning in those empty, hollow sockets. "Come home," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't his brother's voice, it was his own. "Don't listen to it," Alex shouted, grabbing Ben's arm and yanking him backward, but Ben couldn't tear his gaze away. He was trapped in the impossible pull of that voice, his breath shallow, his chest tight. "Don't let it in," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking as her hand clasped around his wrist. "It's not him. It's not real." But the thing in front of them, a distorted shadow of his brother, hollow and wrong, was everything Ben had feared, everything he'd buried deep in his mind. The guilt of his brother's death, the grief he hadn't let go of, the thing that the forest had latched onto, twisted, and made into this horror. "Ben." The voice came again, closer this time, filling his mind with static. His brother's face appeared now, blurry at the edges, eyes wide and pleading. It wanted him to cross the line, it wanted him to reach for it. "Ben, please." The words fractured and the voice began to break apart, warping into something guttural, a low sound that didn't belong in this world. The figures in the fog began to close in on the stone circle, their feet dragging like roots, their faces still, unblinking. Then the totem shattered. The stone circle erupted in a blinding burst of red light. The air screamed. The figures, those lost faces, recoiled, their forms distorting, their bodies disappearing into the storm of light. The earth itself seemed to quake beneath them, the sky flashing a violent shade of purple, swirling with unnatural energy. The trees around them groaned, their trunks bending as if pulled toward the epicenter. Ben staggered backward, eyes wide, and his breath hitched as he tried to shield himself from the overwhelming force of the explosion. The ground beneath him cracked, the stones splitting like glass. The last thing he saw before the world folded in on itself was his brother's face, half human, half nightmarish, melting into the light. Then, nothing. The rain had stopped. The miny air was still. Too still. When Ben opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure where he was. The clearing was gone. The totem was gone. The storm had passed, leaving behind an unsettling quiet, a deafening silence that weighed on him. He was standing in a forest, but not the one he had known. The trees around him were still twisted, their bark scarred, but they were no longer pulsing. The mist had lifted, leaving behind a crisp air. He blinked. His heart pounded against his ribs. Was he dreaming? No, this was real. But the world around him felt wrong. The forest felt too clean, too empty, like it was waiting for something. The shadows in the distance weren't quite shadows. The edges of his vision blurred, but he couldn't bring himself to look away from the space in front of him. Alex and Sarah were beside him, silent. Their faces were blank, but there was something different about them. They weren't entirely themselves. Something had shifted. Ben moved toward them, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on him. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched Alex's shoulder. Alex turned, his eyes wide, but there was nothing in them. Nothing human. Ben, Sarah whispered, but her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was the same child's voice they had heard earlier. Her lips didn't move. Ben, come home. His heart froze. He turned, but the forest wasn't just standing still anymore. It was watching him. The trees swayed, too intentionally, too alive. The sky had turned to an eerie shade of green, the clouds hanging low as though they were closing in on him. And then, from somewhere beyond the horizon, he heard a voice not his brother's, not anyone's. It was the forest, and it was calling him. Ben's breath was shallow, his body rigid as the oppressive silence pressed down on him. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The eerie green sky above was a perfect mirror for the unnatural stillness that had descended upon the forest. Every step he took seemed to echo in the void, louder than it should have been, and yet there was no response from the world around him. No birds, no rustling leaves. The trees, once towering and full of life, now felt like ancient hunched sentinels, waiting for something. Alex and Sarah stood motionless beside him, their eyes distant, their features blank. They were there, but they weren't. He could see the subtle shimmer of something unnatural behind their gazes, like they weren't fully present, as if they were being pulled into the depths of the forest, becoming part of it. "Alex? Sarah?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling, but neither of them responded. They just stared forward, unmoving. The pulse of the forest was loud in his ears now, a thrum deep within the ground. The trees, he could swear they were breathing. The air was too dense, the world too quiet. And yet, it was alive with waiting. Ben turned slowly, his eyes scanning the trees around him. There, beyond the mist, something shifted. A shadow among the trunks. Too tall to be a tree, too fluid to be a person. It was more like a presence that moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, just beyond the edge of his vision, watching him. His skin crawled. Something in his gut told him that this thing, whatever it was had always been there, watching, waiting. The forest had been pulling him toward it from the moment they had stepped off the path. "Ben," the voice echoed, twisted and hollow, like the last remnants of a dream he couldn't escape. He turned, his heartbeat racing. It wasn't Alex or Sarah. The figure standing before him was human, but not entirely. Its skin was pale, its body too thin, like it had been stripped of its life, as if it had been starving, waiting for something to fill it again. The hollow eyes glinted in the faint green light, empty but full of something darker. It took a slow, deliberate step forward. Ben felt his legs lock in place, as though the earth beneath him was pulling him down. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. Ben tried to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened as he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, as though he had already failed, like something was about to happen that couldn't be stopped. His mind flashed back to the totem, to the visions of the forest, to the painful memory of his brother, of the grief that had followed him all these years. The figure stretched out a long, skeletal hand, its fingers too long, too twisted. The air around it hummed, vibrating the very space between them. The mist at the edges of the clearing seemed to draw closer, pressing in as though the forest itself was tightening its grip. "You wanted to forget, Ben." The voice again. It wasn't just the thing in front of him speaking, it was the forest itself. His eyes widened as the realization hit him with sickening force. The forest was speaking through it. The forest had always been there, waiting for their grief, their fear, their regret. It fed on it, twisted it, became it. They had never been lost in the woods. They had been brought here. "No," Ben croaked, shaking his head, trying to break free of the suffocating weight of the words. I can't." "You've already made your choice," the figure said, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, like it was devouring his voice. "You are part of this now. You called us." "No," Ben whispered hoarsely, his mind scrambling for something to hold on to, something real, something that wasn't this nightmare. He looked at Alex and Sarah, their vacant eyes staring forward, their bodies stiff and lifeless. They were fading into the fog, becoming part of the forest's endless hunger. The figure smiled, its lips curling into a grotesque shape. The smile didn't belong to it. It was too wide, too knowing. "It's all the same, Ben. The forest takes what it wants, and it will always take what you cannot let go of, what you refuse to bury." Suddenly, the forest seemed to close in. The trees leaned forward, pressing inward. The ground under Ben's feet began to shift, like the very earth was folding. The air around him felt thick, humid. The green sky overhead darkened, and then the cracking started, the sound of wood snapping, roots shifting beneath the earth. Ben's heart thundered in his chest as he backed away, but the ground seemed to tilt beneath him, forcing him closer toward the figure. Something rose behind it, a presence, an immense shadow, towering, stretching, toward the sky. The very air began to warp and distort, and Ben felt himself pulled forward, as if caught in the current of a great tide. He struggled to break free, but his feet were glued to the earth, as though the very soil was holding him. He tried to scream, but it wasn't his voice. He couldn't scream. The forest pressed in, and then it reached. In one violent movement, the shadow at the edge of the trees lunged toward him like a massive claw, pulling him into the earth. The last thing he heard before the world swallowed him whole was his brother's voice, no longer distorted but clear. "Come home." The earth buckled beneath Ben's feet. The forest was alive, thrumming with a power he couldn't comprehend. The ground itself seemed to pulse, drawing him downward, as if the soil was hungry for his very soul. His limbs were heavy, as though invisible hands had wrapped around his legs, dragging him closer to something vast and terrible beneath the surface. The figure, its features barely visible through the fog, moved toward him with unnatural grace, its hollow eyes still locked onto his. It was waiting for him. No, not just him. It was waiting for them all, for all of them. Alex, Sarah, even the broken fragments of his own soul. They had all been drawn here to this place where the earth remembered and the trees whispered. Scream caught in Ben's throat as the figure reached out its skeletal hand toward his chest, and the forest seemed to shift with it. The air grew thicker, the shadows pressing in from every side, swallowing the edges of reality. The sound of rustling, branches intensified, becoming deafening, like something breathing, something ancient and hungry. "You're not real," Ben gasped, his words strangled by fear, his body trembling, trying to pull away from the pull of the forest, the pull of the thing that stood before him. The words barely left his lips. The air felt suffocating. "You're a trick." The figure tilted its head, its mouth opening, but no sound came from it at first. A laugh, or something that resembled it, echoed from the void around them. It was too familiar, like every nightmare he had ever had, every grief, every sorrow, twisted into one single sound. "You know I'm real," it rasped, its voice deep and reverberating, filling the forest with the weight of truth. "You've always known." Ben's chest heaved as he fought against the weight pressing down on him. No, he thought. This wasn't the truth. This couldn't be what he had come all this way for. He couldn't be trapped here. He couldn't lose everything. Not like this. The forest pulled tighter, the earth seeming to curl around his ankles like fingers. His body fought against the unrelenting force. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears. His mind screamed to break free, but the weight of the forest grew heavier. And then it came to him, clearer than anything before. The forest. It wasn't just the trees. It wasn't just the shadow. It was the memories, the grief, the things they had left behind. Everything they couldn't face. The things buried deep in their hearts. The things they couldn't leave behind. The unresolved. You want to escape, but you can't. The figure's voice was like thunder now, booming and low. "You'll never escape this place. It will always be inside you." Ben's stomach churned. He realized what it was. The figure wasn't just feeding on his grief, it was feeding on all of their grief, their losses, their regrets. It had fed on Sarah's pain, on Alex's, on his. It was their darkest feelings, made flesh. The forest was a trap. And it wasn't just trapping them here physically, it was trapping them mentally. It had woven itself into their very thoughts, into everything they had ever lost. Ben's gaze shifted to Sarah and Alex. They were still standing by his side, but not really. Their eyes were glassy, and their bodies no longer felt like their own. They were already lost. The thing, the forest, was twisting them, like roots growing into their minds, feeding off their brokenness. They were part of it now, and Ben could feel the same thing happening to him, to his own thoughts. But there was one thing he hadn't faced. Something deeper than the guilt. Something he had locked away for so long. The final shackle that kept him from truly being free. His brother. The flood of pain and guilt surged in his chest like a crushing weight. He hadn't been able to save him. He had failed him. That was the forest's power. It fed on the things you couldn't let go. It twisted those things, magnified them, until you were consumed by them. No. Ben gasped through clenched teeth. "No! I don't have to stay here. I choose to leave." The ground around him shifted violently, but he stood firm. The figure grinned wider, its mouth impossibly large now, stretching toward him. Its voice was a dark hum. "You will always be here, Ben." But Ben shook his head again, harder this time. He turned toward the mist-filled trees, the vast forest stretching out before him. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He could feel the roots of his fears, his brother's face, the sorrow, the regret, all of it trying to claim him. He embraced it. He faced it. But this time, he wouldn't let it drown him. He wouldn't let it twist into something worse. "Let you go," Ben whispered, almost to himself, as the forest seemed to tremble. The figure's laughter stopped, and for the first time, the forest stilled. The weight on his chest lifted. The mist around him began to dissipate, and the shadows retreated. The trees that had once loomed so menacingly now stood silent, the runes that had pulsed with dark power fading from the bark. The ground beneath him no longer felt like it was closing in. "You are not me," Ben spoke aloud, finally breaking free from the voice inside his mind, from the presence that had been devouring his thoughts. The forest trembled, the earth shifting beneath his feet. The figure, the thing, screeched, its form beginning to unravel, fading, retreating into the shadows. Ben stood tall. The weight of the forest no longer pressed against him. He felt his body again, his own strength, as though he were truly free for the first time in years. Behind him, the mist was lifting, revealing the path. The trees around him, though gnarled and twisted, now seemed to retreat, allowing him a way out. He glanced back at Sarah and Alex, and they too were breaking free from the forest's grip. Their faces now clear, no longer clouded by the fog of the haunting presence. "We're free," Sarah whispered, her voice raw but stronger. "We're going home." Ben nodded. For the first time, the forest didn't feel like a prison. It was just trees, just earth. And though the shadows would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind, he knew he was no longer trapped by them. The path stretched ahead of them, dark but open. And as they walked, the weight of the storm, the haunting presence, faded into the distance. The path ahead was clear. The mist was lifting, curling away from the forest floor, like smoke dissipating into the air. The oppressive weight that had suffocated them for what felt like an eternity was finally gone. And for the first time, Ben felt like he could breathe. The trees around them stood still, their crooked branches no longer reaching hungrily toward the sky. The forest had released its grip on them, as if it had lost interest now that its prey had escaped. The trail that stretched before them seemed to promise a way out, a way back to the world they once knew. But even as they walked, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him, within them. It was an unfamiliar sensation, like a part of the forest had been left behind in their minds. It wasn't the kind of change that left scars on the skin, but one that lingered deep within their thoughts, hidden just beneath the surface. The grief that had once felt so heavy now seemed strangely absent, replaced by something else. An unsettling emptiness. "Do you feel it?" Sarah's voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but the question cut through the stillness of the air. She didn't even need to elaborate for Ben to know what she meant. He nodded, glancing back at the path they had just come from. The trees loomed, their silhouettes dark against the pale light of the sky. But now there was no sign of the oppressive presence they had felt earlier. Everything seemed so still, so calm. But something gnawed at him, a quiet unease he couldn't shake off. "I don't know," Ben muttered, rubbing his forehead. "It's like the forest is still watching us." Alex, walking behind them, looked up, his face pale but clear of the fog that had once clouded his eyes. He glanced over his shoulder at the darkening woods. "I thought we got out. I thought we were free." "We are free," Ben said, but even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. They had made it out. They had broken free from the forest's grip. And yet, there was something unfinished about it all. Something that lingered like an old wound, that never truly healed. Sarah's hand instinctively reached out to touch the back of Ben's arm, her fingers trembling slightly. Ben, it's not just us, is it? It's the forest, it's still here, isn't it? Ben swallowed hard. He turned his head to the side, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the path led. The world beyond the forest was still distant, just out of reach. They were so close, but that small, lingering part of him still felt drawn back toward the woods. He could still hear the echoes of the voice that had spoken through the forest. The memory of his brother's voice, twisted and distorted. Come home. I don't know if we're really out, he whispered. Maybe we're never really out. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound being the crunch of wet leaves beneath their feet. The forest was changing around them, but there was an undercurrent of foreboding that couldn't be ignored. The path before them was no longer just a way forward. It felt like a test, a fragile thread connecting them to something they couldn't name. Ben stopped suddenly, his heart racing. A flash of movement, just at the edge of his vision. Something tall, something dark, too dark to be a shadow, slipped between the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Alex and Sarah froze. "I didn't see anything," Alex replied, his voice more strained than Ben had ever heard it before. "No, I saw something," Ben insisted. "Back there, just in the trees." He turned, but the forest remained still, eerily so. The faintest rustle of leaves, the barely noticeable shift of the wind, nothing more. Ben took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, what was happening. It was like he was being watched again, but not from the woods. No, this time, it was something within him, something residual, a part of the forest that had followed them, that had latched on to their fears, their memories. He could almost feel it crawling under his skin, deep within his mind, like a lingering presence that refused to let them go. "Ben, maybe we should keep moving," Sarah said softly, but there was a note of fear in her voice. She too felt it now, felt that something was still there, something unseen, watching them from the shadows. Ben nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to place what he had seen, what he had felt. He turned again to face the path ahead, hoping it would be enough to silence the nagging doubts, the echoes of what had happened. But then, there it was again. A whisper, too faint to be sure of, but clear enough to send a chill down his spine. "Ben." The voice, his brother's voice, once again, just as it had before. He spun around, heart pounding, searching the trees for any sign of movement, any shape in the shadows, nothing. Just the forest. Still. Ben was trembling now. It wasn't just the rain or the cold. It was the feeling that the forest was still alive, that it knew them, that it knew him. He wasn't free. Not yet. "We need to hurry," he said, his voice strained. "We need to get out of here now." They moved faster, their steps quickening as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out ahead of them like dark fingers. Every turn, every shift of wind seemed to pull them back toward the woods, toward that unseen presence. "Ben," Alex said again, his voice now filled with panic. "We're free. We've made it out. You need to stop looking back." But Ben couldn't stop himself. His gaze kept flicking behind him, where the trees stood silent like giants waiting in the dark. And then, just as they neared the end of the trail, the faintest tremor passed through the earth beneath their feet. A rumble, deep and foreboding. The ground shifted. The path before them twisted. Ben's heart stopped. The trail didn't lead out anymore. It curved back, it looped, and in the distance, beneath the canopy of trees, something moved. The shadow was there again. And this time, it was closer. The ground beneath their feet was shifting. It wasn't just the path that had begun to twist and bend. It was the very fabric of the world around them. The trees, their branches twisted and skeletal, seemed to bend toward them, almost growing closer, as if the forest itself was tightening its grip once more. The rumbling had stopped, but the air was charged, thick with a dark, oppressive energy that filled Ben's lungs, making it harder to breathe. The shadow they had seen earlier, too tall to be a tree, too fluid to be a person, was no longer at the edges of the trees. It was closer now, moving slowly between the trunks, its form almost blending into the dark, shifting mist that was creeping in from all sides. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if the forest itself was alive, with a mind, a will of its own, and it was waiting. "Ben," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling. Her hand clutched his arm, pulling him toward her. "It's happening again. We're going in circles. This path, it's not real." Ben tried to steady his breathing. She was right. The path, no, the entire forest, seemed to be closing in around them, twisting into a loop that wouldn't let them escape. The exit they had seen, the clearing that promised freedom, was now lost. The way out had been erased. Ben's voice cracked, his chest tightening as the shadows closed in. "We can't keep running. We need to face it. We can't keep running from this." Alex's eyes were wide with panic, but there was a strange calm in his voice when he spoke. "We've already faced it. We're free. We just need to get to the end of this path. The end is somewhere, Ben. We just need to keep moving forward." Ben turned his eyes toward the horizon. He could see it now, just beyond the dark trees. A faint glow, as if the sky itself was lighting up, but not with the warm, comforting light of daylight. It was cold. Red. "No," Ben said, his voice shaking. "That's not the end. That's not what we need. It's part of it. Part of the forest. It's not real." The moment the words left his mouth, the whisper returned. A low, guttural sound that cut through the thick silence of the trees, carrying with it the weight of the past. His brother's voice. His own voice. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled the forest, circling around him, echoing through his mind. "Come home." Ben froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest, the thing that had haunted him, was still here. Not just in the trees, not just in the shadows, but inside him. The memories, the grief, the unresolved pain of his brothers, death, were now alive, stretching their claws into his soul. "It's not over." Ben's voice was barely more than a whisper. "It's never going to be over until I face it. Until I face what I've been running from." Sarah and Alex stood, motionless, their faces pale, their eyes distant. They had become part of the forest too. They couldn't help it. They were trapped in the same way Ben was, haunted by things that weren't just in the woods but within them. "I don't want to be here anymore," Alex said, his voice breaking. "I don't want to remember this." The mist thickened, closing in tighter, but Ben didn't flinch. He was done running. "No," Ben said firmly, turning back toward the trees. "You can't forget. We can't run from this anymore. We need to face it head on." The darkness around them began to pulse, the shadows lengthening as the trees seemed to close in even further. The whispers, his brother's voice, his own voice, grew louder, rising in an almost manic crescendo. And then, from the shadows, it came. The shape, the presence, the shadow that had been watching them, that had been waiting, moved forward. It didn't step. It was everywhere, shifting through the trees like a cloud of darkness, pulling itself toward them with an inevitable force. Its presence was oppressive, like the weight of the forest itself. Ben's heart raced, but he didn't back away. He didn't move. He stepped forward. It was time to face this. The figure emerged into the dim light, its shape finally clear. It was human, yet not. Tall, too tall, its limbs too long, twisted like gnarled branches. Its face was empty, a smooth, blank canvas with deep, hollow pits where eyes should have been. There was no mouth, only darkness. "Ben," the figure said, its voice not spoken, but felt, reverberating inside his chest. "You still carry it. You will never be free." "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Ben replied, his voice stronger now, his chest swelling, with the courage he had been hiding for years. "You won't control me anymore." The shadow reached out a long arm, its fingers like claws stretching toward him. But Ben stood tall, his feet planted firmly in the earth beneath him. He clenched his fists. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This wasn't just a fight against a creature in the woods. This was a fight against his past, against the grief that had kept him captive for so long. "You're not my brother," Ben said, eyes fixed on the empty face of the shadow. "You're not the forest. You're just my fear, and I'm done letting it control me." The air trembled, a crackling energy vibrating through the ground as the shadow screamed, a deep, inhuman sound that shook the forest to its core. The trees around them groaned, the earth splitting in response. Ben closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was the final choice, the final step toward freedom. Not just from the forest, but from the things that had kept him bound to it. The grief, the memories, the fear. When he opened his eyes again, the shadow recoiled, shrinking back. The trees around them creaked and groaned in protest, but the forest could no longer hold him. Ben stepped forward. The shadow dissipated into the mist. The weight of the forest lifted, and with that the path ahead was clear. The mist began to dissipate, fading like smoke in the wind, leaving behind only the bare remnants of what had once been a living nightmare. The forest, dark, oppressive, and suffocating, was no longer the place that held them in its clutches. Now it seemed ordinary, empty. Ben stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath steadying after the battle he had fought, though the weight of everything still lingered on his skin, in his mind. The shadows, the whispers, had receded, leaving only silence behind. The forest was no longer alive with that malignant energy, but there was something more unsettling about the silence. The aftershocks of everything they had faced pulsed like a memory that hadn't quite left. He could still hear the echo of his brother's voice in his mind, the whisper of the forest, the weight of those memories that had shaped him for so long. It was as though they were behind a door he could never quite close, like a part of him would always remain in the woods. But the fog was lifting, and the path that had been obscured by the forest's twisted intentions was now clear. He could see the light of the world beyond, the way back. The sky was brightening, casting the landscape in a soft golden glow. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ben could finally see the road ahead, a world beyond the trees. Sarah and Alex stood beside him now, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes still adjusting to the vastness of freedom. They, too, had felt the weight of the forest, the pull of the unseen forces, and like him, they were slowly realizing that they were no longer part of it. They were standing in the world they had left behind. Do you think it's really gone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She glanced around nervously, as though expecting the trees to come alive again, to swallow them whole. Ben nodded, but his voice was quieter than he intended. I think we're free." Her eyes flicked back to the trees behind them, then to the path ahead. She took a deep breath, looking more uncertain than ever. But what if it's still out there? What if it's still watching us? Alex shook his head. "It's not out there anymore. It's It's gone." His voice was firm, but Ben could hear the tremor underneath it. They both felt it. The forest's grip on them was looser now, but not completely gone. There were things they had faced, things they had seen, that would stay with them forever. And maybe they wouldn't be able to erase the memory of it completely, but they had fought through it. They had survived. "I don't know," Ben said, his voice cracking. He felt that deep, gnawing unease still. There was a part of him, deep, inside, that wondered if it had ever really left. Had they truly escaped the forest? Or was this just a momentary reprieve, a brief sliver of calm before the next chapter? It was then that Ben realized there was nothing to go back to. The world they had left behind, life before the forest, wasn't the same anymore. Their connection to it had been severed. The forest had changed them, and they would never be the same again. Still, the path ahead stretched clear and open as if the forest, the woods, the shadows, all of it, was finally behind them. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, and just as he did, the voice came again. But this time it was not his brother's, not a voice twisted by fear or loss. It was his own. The thought hit him like a wave. "I've let you go." The grief, the regret, the memories. They all dissolved into the wind, slipping away as he took another step forward. The past, the pain, the weight of what had been, it no longer held him. There would always be echoes. Always. The shadows would never completely fade, and there would always be moments when the past would rise up and try to pull him back into the darkness. But he was done being held captive by his own grief. Done letting the forest, the darkness within himself, define who he was. They had made it. The trees were no longer closing in. The shadows were no longer looming. The storm was finally over. They walked together, side by side, into the clearing. Ahead, the road, the way out of the forest, where the world stretched wide and unending. The weight on their shoulders lightened with each step. The pull of the forest growing weaker, fading as the light grew brighter. They reached the edge of the woods and stood there for a moment, the final line between the dark and the light, between the past and the future. The forest behind them was silent now, gone. The path ahead was filled with endless possibility. But even though they had escaped, even though the nightmare was over, a part of Ben knew that the true test had only just begun. The forest had left a mark, a scar that would never fully heal. But it had also given them something else, something far more powerful than any shadow: freedom. And maybe, just maybe, the scars would fade in time. For now, though, there was only the open world ahead, untouched, unbroken, and waiting to be discovered again. The air had a strange clarity now, like the world had been washed clean. The oppressive fog that had once shrouded the forest was gone, and the golden light of dawn stretched across the horizon like a promise. Every step Ben, Sarah, and Alex took away from the forest felt like a victory, but also a subtle betrayal, a disconnect from the life they had left behind, as though they were walking toward something unknown, something that had no clear shape. The forest, now shrinking in the distance, was still there, quiet, silent, but undeniably present. Ben could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a lingering tension, like a shadow clinging to him. The path ahead, bathed in sunlight, felt welcoming, but a deep part of him couldn't shake the sense that something had changed forever. "Do you think we're ever really going to be free of it?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, slightly, as if she had been holding it back all along. Ben glanced over at her. Her face was pale, her eyes reflecting a haunted look that hadn't fully faded. It had been a long journey, longer than any of them had realized. And while the physical path had led them out of the forest, There was still an unsettling truth in the air. They had all changed. "I don't know," Ben replied quietly, his gaze fixed ahead, not looking at the road but somewhere beyond it. His voice was distant, as though he was still listening for something in the silence. "Maybe we can't ever be free of it. Not fully." Alex, walking a few steps ahead, looked back over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice edged with curiosity and uncertainty. "We made it out. We're here. The forest is behind us." Ben stopped walking and looked out over the path they were taking. The road was cracked and weathered, but it was still clear, still open. The farther they walked, the clearer the world seemed. The sun climbed higher, bathing everything in warm light. Yet despite the outward calm, the gnawing feeling inside Ben didn't let go. "I mean, it's still with us," Ben said. "Not in the way the forest was, but in our heads, in our hearts. The grief, the fear, the choices we made." His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. That thing in the woods, it was never just the forest. It was us, our past, the things we couldn't face, couldn't bury. Sarah stopped beside him, her brow furrowed. "Ben, we can't keep thinking that way. We're not going to let it destroy us." We walked out. We left it behind. She put a hand on his arm, her touch soft but firm. "We're alive, Ben. We made it out." Ben looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel that sense of finality, that they were free. But the forest had left a mark on them, a scar that wouldn't fade so easily. It was still too fresh, too close, and no matter how many steps they took away from it, there was a part of it, a part of themselves, that would always remain. "Sarah's right," Alex said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're here now. The forest can't touch us anymore." Ben nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his chest. The silence around them felt too peaceful, too still. The wind had died down. The trees were silent, almost too silent. And as they moved further down the road, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The forest had always been there, just beyond the edge of their perception, waiting. "You don't get it, Alex," Ben said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You think we've left it all behind, but what if it's still inside us? What if that forest, that thing, isn't something we can just outrun? What if it's in our minds now? What if it's waiting for us to crack?" Alex turned to face him, his jaw clenched. "So what? You want to just stand here and let it win? Just because we can't forget it doesn't mean it still has control over us." "I don't know," Ben said, his voice softer now. "But it feels like something's still off, like we're being pulled somehow by it." The three of them stood there for a moment, staring at the long road ahead. But their thoughts were somewhere else, lost in the shadow of the woods, tangled in the memory of what they had left behind. Sarah broke the silence, her voice unexpectedly steady. "I know we can't erase what happened," she said, "but we're here now, and that has to mean something. We're not dead. We didn't lose ourselves out there. We survived." Ben met her gaze and nodded. She was right. They had survived. They had come through something so deep, so powerful, that it would never truly leave them. But they had made it. Together. The echoes of the forest, the shadows it cast, would always be a part of them. But that didn't mean it had to define them. The path ahead was still theirs to walk, and maybe, just maybe, the things that haunted them could be put to rest. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to keep moving forward. "We'll figure it out," Ben said, the weight of his own words finally sinking in. "We'll find a way to live with it, whatever it is, but we have to keep going." The three of them stood in the light for a long moment, the world stretched wide before them. The road ahead was open, but they knew, too, that it would always be shaped by what they had left behind. And just as the final word left his lips, the forest spoke again. But it wasn't a whisper this time. It was a sigh, a breath of wind that carried with it the faintest trace of something they couldn't name, something still out there, just beyond their reach. But it was fading. The echoes were still there, just out of sight. But now they were only whispers, and the path ahead, the real journey, was theirs to decide. The road stretched before them, winding into the distant horizon, bathed in soft golden light. The trees behind them, once gnarled and twisted, now stood still, silent, like distant memories fading into the background of their minds. The mist that had haunted their every step, suffocating and suffused with dread, had finally dissipated. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world before them seemed peaceful, almost welcoming. But there was something in the air that made Ben hesitate, something in the wind that carried a faint familiar scent, the distant tang of wet earth, the lingering trace of pine needles, the hum of a storm that wasn't far behind. It was all too familiar, as if the forest had never truly let them go, and that feeling, the one that kept gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, refused to disappear. The three of them walked in silence, their steps in perfect time, yet each one seemed to carry the weight of 100 unspoken words. Their faces were drawn with the knowledge that they had survived, but no matter how far they walked, the scars remained. The road they walked now was different too. It was wider, open, but the darkness of the woods loomed at the edges, its twisted trees stretching out like fingers, reaching across the open space. It was as though the forest had simply shifted, retreating from their vision, but never fully leaving. "Ben," Sarah said, breaking the silence. She had stopped walking, her eyes locked on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "Do you think we're ever really going to feel safe again?" Ben turned to her, his throat tightening at the question. "I don't know," he said softly. "Maybe we'll never feel completely safe, but that doesn't mean we can't keep moving forward." She nodded, but her eyes remained distant, as though she could still hear the whisper of the woods, calling her name from the edges of her mind. Alex spoke up, his voice quieter than it had been before. "We're here now. We've made it. We're alive." Ben nodded, but the knot in his chest hadn't loosened. He could feel the pull of the forest, its presence growing stronger as he stood there. It was almost as if the forest had never truly let go, like it was still waiting for them to return. His fingers tightened around the strap of his pack, his heart racing. But when he glanced back at the trees, there was nothing. The woods stood still, shrouded in quiet. But it wasn't the woods he was afraid of. It was what the forest had become, inside of them, what it had planted in their minds, in their hearts. The grief, the guilt, the fear, all of it was still there, lingering in the spaces between their words, between their breaths. "Ben," Sarah said again, this time more urgently. She was staring past him, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Look." He turned to follow her gaze. At first he saw nothing, just the road stretching endlessly ahead, the trees standing tall on either side, their shadows long as the sun began to set. But then something shifted in the distance. The shadows at the edge of the woods were moving. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The air grew thick again, like it had the moment they first stepped into the forest. He could feel the pull of it, the whispering, the soft rustling of leaves. It was close, so close now. It was as if the very forest itself had started to bend toward them. "We're still being watched," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. "No," Alex said, his voice shaking. "No, we're free. We've made it out." But Ben could see it now. The shadow. It was back. Not a figure, not a creature, but something more sinister. A presence, ancient and endless. He could feel it surging toward them, a weight pressing down on his chest. It was as if the forest had come alive again, but not in the way it had before. The trees were silent now, not threatening, but waiting. And the path ahead, it was no longer clear. The road they had walked had started to disappear, vanishing into the edges of the forest, blending into the shadows. Ben stood frozen, staring into the darkening woods, his mind reeling. His pulse quickened. It was happening again, the pull, the desire to turn back. "Ben," Sarah whispered, her voice low and fearful. She was right beside him now, gripping his arm. "I can hear it again. The voice, it's calling." Ben nodded. He had heard it too. The voice that echoed deep in his mind, that whispered familiar words. But it wasn't just the forest now. It was something inside him, something deep in his soul. "I know," he said, "but we can't go back. We can't let it pull us in again." But still, as they stood there at the edge of the path, the woods stretched before them, waiting. The road they had walked seemed to shimmer at the edges, fading like the final remnants of a dream. Ben took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had left behind, and everything that still followed them. "We're not going back," he whispered, his voice firm. "The forest can't hold us anymore. Not if we don't let it." Slowly, he turned away from the woods, stepping forward again, toward the open world ahead. And this time his steps were stronger, more certain. Behind him, the forest remained silent. But the echoes would never leave. The whispers would fade, but never disappear. And as the light of the world faded into twilight, Ben realized that it wasn't the forest that haunted them. It was the memories, the shadows in their own hearts, the things they had yet to confront. The forest had merely been a reflection of their own fears, their own griefs. And now that they had left it behind, they had only one choice left: to keep moving forward. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The forest was alive with the sound of rain, heavy, insistent, tapping against the windows of the cabin. The day had begun bright and full of promise, the sun breaking through the canopy of trees in scattered patches of golden light, casting shadows that danced across the cabin's weathered exterior. It had seemed like the perfect place to escape. Just the two of them, Riley and Leah, drawn into the wilderness to leave behind their worries, their noisy lives, and everything that had been too much. They had arrived at the cabin early in the afternoon, their first time here. The road had twisted and turned through the thick woods, narrowing as they descended into the valley, winding closer to the creek that had already begun to swell with the season's rains. Leah had been nervous at first, sensing the quietness of the place, the isolation, the absence of any other sign of life besides the occasional flutter of birds overhead. Riley, on the other hand, was in his element, eager for the break from the city. He was used to the quiet. "I think it's perfect," Riley said, hauling bags into the small cabin, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the empty space. The cabin, a simple structure, was built of rough-hewn logs and a stone fireplace that sat center stage in the main room. There was no electricity, no Wi-Fi, nothing that would distract them from each other, just the wind, the rain, the whispering trees. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, its foundations groaning under the weight of history. Leah wasn't so sure. Something about the silence felt too thick, too suffocating. When she tried to focus on the sound of the creek, it seemed to be closer than it should have been, its steady flow now a steady, almost menacing rush. Riley, though, was already unloading his gear, happy with the sense of peace that came with being removed from everything. The rain began to fall, heavier as dusk crept in. The clouds overhead darkened rapidly, casting an eerie grey light over the valley, turning the world outside into a shadowy blur. Leah tried to ignore the unease growing in her chest, but it only grew worse as the wind began to howl through the trees. She sat by the fire, curling her legs beneath her as Riley prepared dinner in the tiny kitchen. "I'll set up the fire outside," he said as he grabbed a coat and stepped out. The storm was just starting to show its true ferocity. Thunder rumbled in the distance, an echoing growl that seemed to promise a long night ahead. Leah, alone now in the flickering shadows, wrapped herself tighter in the warmth of the cabin. The storm was growing, becoming more and more like a force of nature. It wasn't long before the wind began to howl in earnest, the trees outside bending under the weight of the rain. Every so often the thunder cracked so loudly that it rattled the windows. Leah felt her nerves begin to fray as she sat by the fire, staring into the flames. When Riley returned, his face was pale. "The creek is rising. I don't think we'll be able to cross it tomorrow. If this keeps up, we'll be stuck here for days." Leah stood, walking to the window and peering out. The creek, which had looked small and harmless when they first arrived, was now a torrent of water, swirling with debris, surging unnaturally fast. It was frightening to watch, but Riley was right. There was no going anywhere now. The storm had closed them off from the world. "I don't like this," Leah murmured, her voice tight. "It'll be fine," Riley reassured her, though his tone lacked conviction. He looked out at the trees, his gaze darkening as the first cracks of lightning lit the sky. But as the night wore on, something felt wrong. The storm didn't seem to ease. If anything, it intensified, feeding on itself, swelling like an unstoppable beast. Leah's unease grew with each passing hour. Every gust of wind felt like it was whispering something, and she couldn't tell if it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind or something else, something more sinister. Just before midnight, as the storm reached its crescendo, Leah stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter. The sound of the creek roaring beyond the cabin's walls was deafening now, mingling with the ever-closer rumblings of thunder. She jumped when the floorboards creaked behind her, but when she turned, Riley wasn't there. He had gone to bed, but the cabin felt unnervingly empty, as if it was holding its breath. Her heart began to race, the oppressive silence around her making the storm's fury seem distant, unreachable. The wind howled again, this time sounding almost different, more like a wail. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the wind, but then she heard it again, louder, closer. Her pulse quickened. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was pressing against the walls, clawing at the cabin like something was trying to get in. The door rattled. Leah froze, staring at the wood panel, her heart thumping violently in her chest. Another bang. This one so hard that the floor shook beneath her feet. Something was outside. The silence that followed felt like it held its breath, suspended in time. She couldn't breathe. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. "Riley?" But there was no answer. She moved slowly, cautiously, toward the door. The sound of rushing water, of something heavy being dragged through the creek, was so loud now it almost drowned out her heartbeat. Leah reached for the handle, but it felt cold beneath her fingers, colder than it should have been. The wind pushed against the door, making it rattle. Another thump came from the direction of the forest. Suddenly, the lights flickered and then went out, leaving only the dim glow of the fire. The cabin felt even more suffocating in the dark. Leah turned back toward the living room. The shadows were deeper now, stretching unnaturally across the walls, as if the room was alive, breathing. A shape. She saw it in the corner of the room, a dark figure just beyond the doorway. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her breath caught in her throat, and she backed away, reaching for the nearest object, an old lantern. The glow was weak, but it illuminated the room just enough to give her a semblance of comfort. Another thump, closer this time. The door. "Riley," she called out again, her voice trembling. She spun in place, scanning the room. There was no answer. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but where would she go? Outside was nothing but darkness and rain. She glanced out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The creek was now a chaotic force, tumbling with debris, and the bridge. What was left of it was barely visible. There was no escape. The storm had her trapped. Then she heard it. Footsteps behind her. Soft, hesitant. Coming closer, so close she could feel the air shift. Leah turned sharply, but there was no one there. Her pulse raced and her thoughts spiraled into a panicked frenzy. What was happening? What had come into this place? The storm outside seemed to stop, as though it was listening, waiting. The house was silent, but that silence now felt as threatening as the howling wind. In the darkness, the shadows seemed to pulse, as if something was moving, stretching, growing. And then, through the crack in the door, she saw it. Something small, floating in the churning waters. Something she didn't want to see, didn't want to acknowledge. But the longer she stared at it, the clearer it became. A child's doll, caught in the swirling current. A chill ran down her spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And then the lights flickered again, and the door burst open, slamming against the wall. The storm, the wind, the water. They were no longer just outside. They were inside now. Inside her mind. Inside her home. It had begun. The wind had stopped, or at least it seemed to have, though the eerie stillness that followed the storm's fury felt like the calm before something far worse. Leah stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding against her chest, her breath shallow and jagged. The door had slammed open with an unnatural force, as if it had been flung wide by hands she couldn't see. The warmth of the fire flickered uncertainly in the hearth, casting faint shadows that seemed to sway and twist in ways they shouldn't. The creek had become a living thing, a beast roaring outside the cabin's walls, filling the spaces with its growls, its endless churn of water debris, and the threat of drowning. Leah glanced toward the window, her mind reeling. The storm, still fierce but quieter, had turned the world outside into a grey, mist-shrouded expanse. But there was something else, something moving in the water, something far too large and wrong to be just the flood's debris. And then the doll, drifting in the creek, caught her eye again. It had been there just a moment ago, a fragile figure of porcelain and fabric, floating aimlessly like a lost soul. Now it was gone. In its place was a dark shadow, swirling within the water, closer to the cabin's edge. She leaned closer to the window, straining her eyes to see. The rain had let up enough that the creek's surface was visible, but in that moment of clarity, the swirling currents seemed to take on an almost deliberate quality, as though they were being guided. She couldn't breathe. A tight knot had formed in her chest. Was it the storm? Was it something that had always been there, hidden beneath the creek's surface? No. It was the unnatural way the water swirled, the way the shadows seemed to shift with it. Leah turned quickly toward the door, and that was when she heard it. A whisper. Her heart leapt in her throat. The sound was soft but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of the room, from just behind the door, where she had seen the shadow flicker earlier. She knew she wasn't imagining it this time. The yo sound grew louder, a low, guttural whisper like the murmur of voices just beyond reach. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the walls like an invasive presence. She stepped back slowly, her back pressed against the opposite wall. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, a weight settling over her like a shroud. Her thoughts raced. She needed to wake Riley, needed to escape, but the darkness in the cabin was pressing in from every angle. It felt alive now, breathing with her, feeding off the fear that crawled under her skin. "Riley," she called, her voice quivering, more a plea than a question. There was no answer. The cabin remained unnervingly still. The whispering continued, growing in volume, as if more voices were joining in, too many to count, too many to distinguish. The air felt damp and thick, as if it were heavy with something unspeakable. Her eyes darted to the door, now wide open, its frame filled with an unnerving blackness that seemed to stretch beyond the cabin itself. The storm was no longer a mere storm. It was something far more malicious. The silence between the gusts of wind felt like a silence of waiting, waiting for something to arrive, something that had no intention of leaving. With a rush of urgency, Leah crossed the room, her fingers fumbling with the matchbox. She struck a match, igniting the lantern in her trembling hands. The dim light danced and flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Her feet moved on their own accord as she approached the door. She couldn't stay in here. She couldn't stay trapped in this cabin, with whatever was lurking just beyond the threshold. But as she stepped closer, a cold gust of wind suddenly surged into the room, extinguishing the lantern's flame in an instant. She gasped, her pulse racing, heart pounding in her chest. The shadows seemed to grow, to consume everything in the room. The whispering voices intensified. It felt like they were coming from the walls, from the floor, from deep within the earth.
"Itself, Leah," the voice hissed. "Leah, come." It wasn't Riley's voice. It wasn't even human. Her body froze, and the world around her seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but that voice, that whisper.
It was beckoning her, pulling at her soul, weaving its way through her mind like a slow poison. She shook her head violently, desperately trying to clear her thoughts. No, she wouldn't fall for it. She wouldn't. She forced her legs to move, running toward the kitchen, toward the small window at the back of the cabin. But as her eyes swept across the darkened room, the outline of a figure loomed in the far corner, tall and angular, its form not quite solid, but somehow filling the room in a way that seemed to bend the light around it. For a brief, terrifying moment, Leah thought she saw something in the darkness, a face, hollow and pale, eyes wide with a terrible hunger. But before she could react, it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. Her breath caught in her throat. The storm outside was no longer the worst thing. Whatever had been released was now inside the cabin too. Leah ran to the window, yanked it open, and the fresh night air hit her like a slap to the face. The rain was heavier now, and the water in the creek had swollen beyond its banks. There was a dark mass in the water, drifting near the edge of the cabin, just beyond the small patch of land. At first, Leah thought it was just debris, but as she stared at it, her heart lurched. It was moving. No, it was alive. Her breath hitched and she stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over her own feet. That thing, whatever it was alive. The water was rising fast now, pushing its way toward the cabin's foundation. But that was not the worst of it. The whispering came again, louder now, closer. She swung around to face the cabin's interior. The shadows no longer seemed like mere tricks of the storm. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. A thump, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the far side of the room. Riley. She ran down the hallway to their bedroom, her heartbeat thudding. In her ears, her mind torn between fear for him and the unrelenting dread that something was coming. Something had always been here. The door was ajar. Inside, Riley stood near the bed, his back to her, his shoulders tense, his head slightly tilted. His hair, wet from the rain, clung to his face, and his usual calm expression was absent. The air around him felt colder, heavier. "Riley?" Leah whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. She stepped forward, her pulse spiking. The moment she crossed the threshold, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the whispering grew louder, as if 1,000 voices were now speaking through him, speaking to her. His figure seemed to shimmer, distorting slightly, as if reality itself was bending. Then, with a shudder that racked his body, Riley turned. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated to nearly black. His lips moved, but no sound came out, as if he was struggling to say something, struggling to speak at all. But that wasn't Riley anymore. The figure in front of her wasn't him. It was something else, something that had taken him, and it was waiting for her to come closer. The air in the cabin felt thick, stale, and suffocating. Riley's form, no longer familiar, stood motionless by the bed, his eyes hollow and dark, his mouth moving in ways that didn't match the way his lips trembled. Leah could feel the floor beneath her feet vibrate with the intensity of her pulse, and it took all her willpower to keep from bolting for the door. But there was nowhere to run. There was no escape from whatever had taken hold of Riley. It was him, but it wasn't. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch towards him, their forms warping, distorting the very air around them. His figure flickered, shifting as though reality itself was trembling, like a bad dream that threatened to overtake her consciousness entirely. The storm outside had intensified again, the wind howling against the windows like a chorus of voices, crying in pain. Leah felt as if the entire world had become a cage, closing in tighter with each passing moment. "Riley?" Her voice broke as she stepped forward, the words barely escaping her throat. She didn't know what she was expecting, but whatever it wasn't the response she received. His head jerked toward her, his mouth opening wide. His lips pulled back into an unnatural grin, one that revealed teeth far too sharp, far too jagged. The sound of his voice was not his own. It was deeper, guttural, a mixture of voices layered on top of each other. "Come closer." The words came out in a raspy, chilling whisper, a chorus of tortured cries interwoven in the sound. Leah's stomach churned. She could feel the room shift around her, could almost sense the invisible weight pressing down from every angle. The shadows in the room crawled toward her, inching forward like they were alive, like they were drawn to her, hungry for her. It was happening again. The whispers, the movement in the dark, the feeling of something hunting her. She took a step back, and Riley's mouth opened wider, his voice splitting and distorting further, becoming a maddening cacophony of laughter, growls and screams. It was not Riley. It was something else. Something that had attached itself to him, something that wanted her to come closer. Leah's instinct screamed at her to flee, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. Whatever he had become, whatever was inside him now, it held her in its grip. And the more she stood there, rooted in place, the more the darkness seemed to seep into her very soul, suffocating her with a dreadful sense of inevitability. The figure, no longer fully human, began to sway, its form warping again like the flicker of a flame caught in the wind. The air felt thicker, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever force had entered the cabin. Leah gasped as the door to their bedroom slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the room into darkness. The lantern's faint flicker was the only light remaining, and it cast warped, unsettling shadows across the walls. She stumbled backward, but before she could take another step, the walls seemed to close in around her, tightening like a vice. Every direction was shadow, every sound was distorted, the floodwaters outside roiling with malevolent intent. But the worst of it, the whispers. They were no longer coming from Riley. They were coming from everywhere. You are trapped now. There's no escape. Leah's heart raced as the temperature in the room plummeted, her breath now coming out in ragged gasps. She staggered back, desperately trying to push the dark energy away, but the weight of it pressed down harder, suffocating her, filling her lungs with a burning sensation that made her throat constrict. It had been building up, this oppressive feeling, this sense of something following her, something watching her. At first, it was just the whispers, the strange occurrences at the cabin, the feeling of the storm drawing closer, making everything feel wrong. But now she realized the storm outside had nothing on the storm inside her own mind. A crack of thunder sounded outside, deafening, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. The walls of the cabin seemed to vibrate with it, as if the storm itself had become part of the structure, its pulse syncing with hers, driving her mad with fear. And then she heard it, a soft, wet thump. Leah turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked toward the window. The floodwaters had risen, creeping in under the doorframe. The creek had risen faster than she ever imagined it could, the water now pushing in at an alarming rate. And from the churning mass, something was beginning to emerge, something large, dark, and unmistakably alive. It was no longer just a creek, it was a conduit. It had carried something with it, something that had been waiting, biding its time, waiting for the flood to bring it forth. Leah gasped, stumbling backward, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. A large, twisted shape began to emerge from the depths of the water. An elongated figure, covered in what looked like torn, decaying fabric, moving with an unnatural grace as it slid toward the cabin. It was not a creature that should be alive, nor was it entirely dead. It was something caught between worlds, a monstrous thing dragged from some forgotten realm, summoned by the very floodwaters she had so carelessly ignored. As it moved closer, Leah's blood ran cold. Its form twisted and writhed, dragging itself across the water, its limbs like twisted branches reaching out with a hunger that went beyond the physical. The air was thick with its stench, rotting, damp, and something worse, something chemical, something that burned her nostrils as she gasped for breath. The whispers around her grew louder, more frantic. The walls of the cabin pulsed with the rhythm of the thing outside. It was no longer just a storm. It was a presence, a force that had risen, unleashed, and now it was inside. She turned away from the window, trying to distance herself from the sight, but the shadows in the room swirled tighter around her. Riley, that thing, was still standing. By the bed, unmoving, still locked in its twisted form, his eyes fixed on her with an unblinking, hollow gaze. The dark mass outside was now so close, its twisted limbs nearly brushing the foundation of the cabin. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and for a moment, she felt completely lost. Trapped. There was no escape. The flood had already taken the world. Outside, and now it was reaching inside. She could hear the thing moving outside, could feel its breath against the walls. It was waiting for her to make a move to draw closer. It had already claimed Riley. It had already claimed the land. Her eyes flicked back to Riley, but now, he was no longer standing alone. Figures, shadowy, indistinct, but unmistakably human, were beginning to form around him. The figures seemed to rise from the ground itself, stepping out of the shadows, dragging their broken forms across the cabin's floor, their eyes hollow, their movements slow but deliberate. The thing outside, the thing in the water, it had not come alone. It was bringing more with it. Leah's breath hitched as the realization set in. There was no escape. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were alive, breathing in sync with the twisted creatures that had begun to form in the shadows. Leah could barely stand, her legs weak from the terror surging through, her lungs desperate for air. The storm outside continued to rage, the howl of the wind mixing with the relentless roar of the floodwaters. But inside, it was different. The silence between the howling winds was filled with the scraping of something moving within the shadows. Something wrong. Riley, that thing that used to be him, had not moved. His face was still locked in that horrible, vacant stare, his body rigid, his hands twitching slightly as if beckoning something toward him. The figures around him, figures that shouldn't have been here, figures that defied nature, moved slowly, deliberately, crawling toward Leah with a haunting slowness that twisted her stomach in knots. They were not human. They were something else. Ghosts, shadows, or worse, twisted remnants of the people who had once lived here, trapped by whatever dark force had claimed this valley. The thing outside, the monstrous mass in the water, was still lurking near the cabin's foundation, its limbs stretching unnaturally, scraping the ground as it moved. It wasn't the water itself, not just the flood that was disturbing, but what it was dragging with it, those entities that should not exist. And Leah had realized something terrible. They weren't just haunting the cabin, they were trying to pull her into their world. Her breath became shallow, and panic surged through her chest as she stumbled backward, her fingers brushing the walls. The shadows moved closer, their twisted forms curling around the room, their heads lolling at odd angles as if each one had once lived, but now they were nothing but broken remnants. Their eyes, hollow and dark just like Riley's, watched her with an insatiable hunger, their mouths opening in silent screams that echoed in her mind. Suddenly, Riley's voice broke through the thick silence. It was not the voice she remembered. It was lower, distorted, a broken thing. "Leah, they're waiting for you." The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with the same unnatural frequency that the storm had taken on. Leah shuddered. There was no longer any trace of the man she had known. He had been replaced, consumed by whatever had invaded his body. She could see the faint shimmer of something dark, writhing inside him like a shadow crawling just beneath his skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air around her thickened and her throat felt tight. She could barely breathe. The figures continued to crawl forward, their limbs jerking in unnatural ways, their bodies distorting as if they were trying to reform into something recognizable. They had faces, twisted, fractured faces that barely resembled the humans they once were. One of them, a man maybe, dragged himself closer to her. His skin was pale and decaying, his eyes milky and unseeing, but his mouth was wide open, stretching in an unnatural grin. Leah stumbled back, horrified by the grotesque display. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, this time from somewhere inside her own mind. "We've been waiting for you." The words were everywhere. They pressed on her skull, filled her ears, distorted her thoughts. They weren't just coming from Riley or from the figures in the room, they were coming from the water, from the mass outside, the one that had risen from the creek, the one that had carried the storm with it. The thing had a purpose. It wasn't just destroying the land, consuming everything in its path, it was calling to her. Her mind snapped into overdrive, her survival instincts taking over. There had to be a way out. She couldn't let herself be pulled into this nightmare. She couldn't give in to whatever force was trying to drag her into the flood, into the abyss that was rising both inside and outside the cabin. But it was too late. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second, the walls closing in as if the cabin itself was being swallowed by the storm. The flood had reached the very heart of the valley. She could feel the water's presence creeping into her thoughts, filling her veins, pulling her deeper into the flood's grip. The thing outside had already taken the land. The forest was no longer a haven, it was a prison, a waiting ground for whatever was drawing closer. Suddenly, with a violent crack, the ceiling above her gave way, the wood splintering and raining down. The cabin groaned as if the very structure was being pulled into the earth. Leah screamed, dodging the debris as a piece of the ceiling crashed into the floor next to her. The figure closest to her lunged forward, its skeletal hand reaching for her. But she didn't have time to react. The flood had already breached the cabin's foundation. The water surged in with a deafening roar, flooding the room in seconds, dragging everything with it. The shadows, the twisted figures, and Riley. His body, already slack, was pulled from the corner. His limbs jerked unnaturally, as if the thing inside him had come alive and was now leaving him behind. The flood swallowed him, dragged him into its depths. Leah gasped as the current began to pull at her, the force of the water sucking her toward the window. Her body slammed against the walls as the flood swept her off her feet. She kicked, fought for purchase, but the water was too strong. Her breath was torn from her lungs as the flood pulled her toward the open door. Her eyes were wide, frantic, searching for any escape. Her feet scraped against the floorboards, but she was already too deep into the water. The cabin was collapsing, the walls splintering, the roof cracking. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the sound of the storm, the groaning of the earth beneath her. Then something gripped her ankle. A cold, clammy hand. She looked down, her heart racing. A pale face emerged from the water, one of the twisted figures, its lips stretched into an agonizing scream. It was pulling her down into the depths of the creek, into the flood. "No!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the water. Her vision blurred as she was dragged down into the blackness of the creek. The flood was no longer just the storm. It was them, the twisted, hungry souls that had been drawn to her. The water was full of them now, creatures that had once been human, trapped in a nightmare, reaching out with skeletal hands. And Leah realized too late that the flood had always been here, waiting for her. The storm, the water, the figures, it had all been drawing her into this moment. The flood was no longer just the earth's vengeance. It was a portal, a gateway to something darker, something ancient that had been unleashed by the storm's fury. And now, Leah was part of it. The darkness enveloped her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Leah felt herself sinking deeper into the cold, churning waters, her body weightless, but trapped by the relentless pull of the flood. Her lungs burned, her limbs felt heavy. And yet, the coldness that filled her seemed to seep into her very bones, freezing her in place. She could no longer hear the storm above, the roar of the creek, or even the frantic whispering voices that had filled the cabin. All she could hear was the deafening silence of the water, the silence that seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing her whole. She reached out in a panic, her fingers brushing against something smooth and slick, cold stone, the remnants of something ancient, submerged beneath the flood. The current tugged at her, dragging her farther into the depths. The flood had already taken the cabin, taken Riley, taken everything. She was lost, suffocating in this inescapable world of water and shadows. The figures from the cabin, those twisted, decaying remnants of humanity, were all around her now. Their cold, skeletal hands reached out from the dark, their faces frozen in agony, their empty eyes pleading for something she could not give. The flood was their home now, their prison, and soon it would be hers too. She fought against the pull, kicking her legs, desperate for the surface. But the deeper she went, the more she felt the weight of the water pressing against her, as though it were not just a physical force, but a presence, an ancient, hungry thing that was pulling her into its depths, consuming her. Her chest ached, her vision began to blur, and just when she thought she could hold on no longer, something reached up from beneath her. A hand, cold as death, grasped her wrist. She gasped, her breath a sharp, painful intake, but the hand tightened, its fingers wrapping around her, dragging her down faster, deeper into the abyss. Her eyes snapped open in panic. She was no longer sinking. She was being pulled, dragged into the very heart of the flood, into something that was waiting for her, something that had been calling her the entire time. And then, in the dark depths, she saw it, a figure, no, not a figure, but a shape, a presence, vast and impossible to describe. It was larger than anything human. more ancient than time itself. It hovered just beneath the water's surface, its form barely discernible, a shifting mass of shadow and light. But there was no mistaking the intent behind it. The thing was waiting for her. Its presence was undeniable, oppressive, and suffocating. It was the force behind the flood, the storm, the figures that had followed her into the cabin. The whispers, too faint to hear above the rushing water, suddenly filled her mind. They were not voices anymore. They were a thought, a pulse, a signal, a demand. You're here now. Leah's heart raced in her chest, her breath caught in her throat as the thing, the presence, began to move. She could feel it in her very bones, vibrating through the water, pressing against her skin. She was no longer fighting the water. She was fighting it in her soul. The flood, the storm, the things that had been waiting, they weren't just part of the earth. They were part of her now. The thing in the depths had chosen her. Her mind spun as she struggled to understand. This place, this valley, this creek, had always been more than a natural force. It had always been a gateway, a conduit, a portal to something darker, something that had slumbered for centuries beneath the land. The storm had been the catalyst, the flood the manifestation, and she was the offering. In her panic, her mind grasped at fleeting memories. Her mother's voice, a distant whisper of warning, the eerie stillness of the valley when they arrived, the oppressive air that had clung to everything, the old tales, the stories of things that dwelled deep within the earth, things that could not be bargained with, that never died. They were bound to this land, and they were hungry. Leah's vision swam as the water continued to rise. She couldn't escape. The coldness was consuming her. The shapes surrounding her were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on her with desperate hunger. They were waiting, and the presence, the vast, ancient thing that loomed just out of sight, was feeding on her fear. She struggled against the current, but her body felt weak, her limbs no longer obeying her commands. The thing in the water was feeding on her, pulling at her very soul. She thought of Riley, thought of how he had changed, how he had been consumed by whatever dark force was behind all of this. It was too late for him, and it was too late for her. But then, something within her shifted. Perhaps it was the years of grief she had buried deep inside her, the loss she had never fully let go. Of the weight of everything she had tried to outrun, perhaps it was the last vestige of her own will, clinging to life, to survival. She fought back. She reached deep into herself, into that hidden part of her that had survived loss and fear before, the part that refused to give up. She had no illusions. Now, the flood, the storm, the twisted things in the water, they were not natural. They were not bound by anything she understood. But she could still fight. Her hand broke free of the cold grasp that had dragged her into the depths, and she reached for the surface. But as she did, she saw it. The presence, the thing that had waited for her. It was not just a shape in the water, it was the land itself, twisted and broken, an ancient entity that existed far beyond the physical world. It was the storm, it was the flood, it was everything that had ever been buried here in this valley. It opened its eyes. Leah felt the weight of its gaze pierce her soul, and for a moment she felt herself being consumed by it, by the knowledge that she was nothing, a speck in the vast, incomprehensible void. Her body was now an offering to it, a link between the mortal world and the ancient horrors that lay beneath. But as the flood reached up to claim her, she found something unexpected. Resilience. She was not just a victim of this place. She had fought too long to die now. With every ounce of strength she could summon, she threw herself toward the surface, kicking against the water, her fingers brushing against the cold stone beneath. The flood tried to pull her back, the hands of the dead reaching from every corner of the abyss to drag her down again. But she kept pushing. She wasn't ready to become a part of this nightmare. Her lungs burned with the effort, her body aching from the strain, but she could hear something. The call of the storm, the thing that had trapped her in this nightmare, was weakening. She had disrupted it. The flood was no longer just consuming. It was struggling, fighting against something she couldn't yet comprehend. She broke the surface with a gasp, her chest heaving, her mind spinning. The cabin was still in ruins, the water rising rapidly. But she was alive. She had made it to the surface, though the weight of the flood still pressed down on her. But she had not been consumed, and as she fought for breath, she saw it. Them, the twisted figures from the cabin, the remnants of those lost in the flood, standing on the shore, watching her with those empty, pleading eyes. They had once been people. They had once been alive. But they had given everything to the storm. They had become part of the flood, part of the thing that had risen from the depths. And now it was her turn. Leah's breath was ragged, her chest aching with every inhale as she floated in the freezing floodwaters. Her hands scraped against the remnants of the shattered cabin's foundation, seeking something, anything, to hold on to. The storm still raged around her, the wind howling as the flood surged relentlessly, swallowing everything in its path. The world around her was chaos, an oppressive mix of dark waters, roiling clouds, and the twisted shadows of the dead that had once been human. She had broken through the surface, but she was far from free. The flood had not relented, the weight of it pressing down on her, as if the very land had claimed her, was demanding her sacrifice. And she understood now. The storm wasn't merely a storm. The flood wasn't just a force of nature. It was alive, and it had waited for her. It had always been waiting for someone to return to the valley, to stir it from its slumber. She was its chosen, whether she wanted it or not. The figures from the cabin were scattered across the flood, their twisted bodies bobbing in the water like macabre debris. They were no longer people, not in any real sense. They were remnants, broken, desperate souls trapped in the liminal space between life and death, forever pulled by the hunger of the land, by the storm. And now they reached out to her, their pale eyes wide and unblinking, their hands clawing for her as they slowly, inevitably, succumbed to the flood's tide. Leah's heart thudded painfully against her chest. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't become one of them. But she was losing strength. The flood was pulling at her with every wave, dragging her deeper into its endless grip. She kicked against the current, her body shuddering with cold. But her arms felt like lead, her legs weak from the constant battle. The storm above her felt closer, the air dense with static, thick with an unnatural hum that vibrated through her skull. The thing in the depths, the thing that had awakened, with the storm, was still watching her. It had followed her from the moment she arrived at the cabin, its presence like a shadow clinging to her every move. And now, it was closer than ever. She turned, her eyes darting toward the swirling darkness of the creek, trying to see beyond. The water. The flood had reached its peak, and the waters churned with a violence that made her feel insignificant, helpless. But then, in the deepest part of the creek, a shape emerged, a form rising from the depths, slow and deliberate, like a monstrous figure drawn from nightmares. It was impossible to comprehend, an ancient, twisted thing, far larger than anything. Human, its shape a tangled mass of writhing limbs and shifting shadows. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly, ethereal light, a light that seemed to pulse, to call out to her, to beckon her into its depths. The thing was alive, a manifestation of the valley's ancient hunger, of the forces that had been trapped beneath the earth for centuries, waiting for the right moment to surface. The flood had always been its prison, but now it was free. Leah's pulse quickened as she felt it in the air, in the water. The thing was drawing closer, pulling itself out of the abyss, its dark form blotting out the sky. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and for a moment she was weightless, floating in a sea of shadow. The dead figures around her began to reach up, their hands still clawing at her, and Leah understood. They had become a part of it. Their souls had been taken, absorbed into the force that was rising from the creek. And now it was her turn. The water around her rippled, and the temperature dropped. She could feel the thing's presence in every fiber of her being, a cold, suffocating pressure that made it impossible to breathe. The darkness pressed in from all sides, as if the very flood had become sentient, alive with hunger. And then, for the briefest of moments, Leah was not alone. In the murky depths, she could see someone, a pale, ghostly figure, its face contorted in agony. It was Riley. His body, still and lifeless, floated just beneath the water's surface, his eyes empty, his mouth slightly open in a silent scream. He had been claimed by the thing in the flood, his soul lost to whatever had haunted this valley for so long. The flood had taken him, just as it had taken so many before. And now, it wanted her too. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, and in that moment, she could feel it. His presence. The last remnants of him, lingering in the water, trapped by the same force that had claimed him. It was not him. Not really. It was only a shadow of him, a broken fragment of a person who had once been real, now lost in the depths. But she felt it. His grief, his confusion, his final moments of terror, and most of all, his surrender. It was too late for him. Her heart twisted with pain, but she knew deep down that if she stayed in this place, if she allowed the flood to claim her, she would become just like him. Just another broken soul, lost in the endless tide, a part of whatever malevolent force ruled this land. She couldn't let it take her. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Leah pushed herself to the surface, gasping for air, her lungs on fire. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the jagged remnants of the cabin's roof. The storm raged overhead, but the flood was calmer now, as if the thing in the depths had grown satisfied, waiting, patient. The valley had claimed so much, and Leah was next. Her fingers clenched around the shattered wood, but as she clung to the wreckage, she heard it, the whispering. It had never stopped. The voices of the dead, the whispers of the things that had been consumed, that had been lost, swirled around her like a swarm of insects, crawling under her skin. It was the storm, the land, the flood, all of it blending together in a haunting, maddening symphony of loss. Leah, the voice murmured again, but it was different now, softer, more familiar. It wasn't the thing from the depths. It wasn't the storm. It was Riley. His voice, fragile, almost drowned by the storm, whispered her name once more, a call she couldn't ignore. Leah, come back to me. She shuddered, her heart aching as she turned her head toward the direction of the voice. The floodwaters swirled with unseen shapes beneath her, but in the midst of it she saw him. Not the twisted thing, not the force that had consumed him, but a reflection, a piece of him. His face appeared to her, his form flickering, broken, caught between this world and the next. Her chest tightened. She had no time left. The flood had been her end, her beginning, and now it was going to take her again. But this time, she wouldn't go quietly. The storm had stolen everything. Her peace, her safety, her connection to the world. But the last piece of herself, the last shred of who she had been, was here. She wasn't going to give it up. Not like Riley, not like the others. She closed her eyes, whispered her last goodbye to the reflection of the man she had loved, and then, with a final cry of defiance, she let herself go. Her body was pulled under, the floodwaters closing over her, but this time, she fought. The storm may have claimed her body, but her soul was still hers. Leah's senses were ablaze, every nerve in her body alive with a terrifying mixture of fear and defiance. The flood had her. The storm had her. Yet somehow she still fought. Her body was pulled under the water once again, but this time there was no surrender, no fear. She wouldn't let it consume her. Not like Riley. Not like the others. Her fingers found something solid in the murky depths, a stone, a piece of the earth itself, buried beneath the flood, as old as the valley, as ancient as the land. She clung to it, using every ounce of strength she had left to push herself upward. The water fought against her, the current tugging and tearing at her body, trying to drag her back to the abyss. But Leah fought harder, her chest heaving as she broke through the surface once more, gasping for air. The world above was chaos. The storm raged above, howling through the trees, its fury unrelenting, as if it had become an extension of the thing lurking in the depths of the valley. The floodwaters lapped around her, threatening to pull her under once again. The figures from the cabin, the twisted remnants of the dead, still hovered near her, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching for her. They were not human anymore. They were just pieces of the storm, pieces of the land's hunger. The thing in the water was still waiting. She could feel it, feel its presence in every part of her being, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Its ancient, impossible shape was looming just beneath the surface, watching her with eyes that were not eyes, with hunger that was not hunger. It was a force, a living thing, and it had chosen her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her heart, pounding like a drum, faster, louder with every passing second. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she knew that the flood, the storm, it wasn't just some random force of nature. It was something far older. It had always been here. It had been waiting for someone like her to come. Her vision blurred as the water continued to rise, the cabin now just a shadow in the distance, swallowed by the flood. The land was dying, the valley consumed by the thing that had always been here. The flood had spread, drowning the land in its wake, and now it was ready to take her. She could feel its cold fingers wrapping around her mind, its whispers becoming clearer. Leah. The voice echoed in her mind, a hollow, distant whisper, but it was no longer just a voice. It was more, a force, a presence, 1,000 souls, lost to the flood, now bound to it, feeding on it. And they were the storm. They were the valley. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself upright, but the flood was everywhere now, swirling around her, taking everything. The air was thick with the storm's presence. It was closing in, suffocating, smothering. Her thoughts raced, and in that moment, a horrifying truth pierced through her panic. There was no escaping, not unless she sacrificed herself. She was the last piece the flood needed to fully awaken. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she could feel it. The valley, the land, the storm. It was reaching out for her, trying to claim her, trying to pull her into the depths once and for all. She saw it then, the true form of the thing beneath the water. Its shape had never been fully revealed, but now, in the dark of the flood, it was clear. It was vast, immense, a mass of darkness and light, a shape that defied understanding, that couldn't be contained by the earth itself. It was everything, the storm, the flood, the valley itself. It had no face, no eyes, only a presence so powerful that it overwhelmed her senses. It had been buried for so long beneath the land, but now it was free, and it wanted her. Leah's body shook with terror, but her mind was clear. This was the reckoning. The storm, the flood, the valley. None of it had been random. It had all led to this moment. She had come to the valley to escape, but she had only become part of the land's hunger, part of the thing waiting for her. She had to stop it. She had to end it before it consumed the rest of the world. But there was no easy way to destroy something so ancient, so bound to the land itself. She could feel the pull of the land, of the thing in the water pulling her closer, threatening to swallow her whole. She was already a part of it. But there was something else. A flicker of hope, of rebellion that burned inside her chest. She had not been chosen by the thing. She had chosen to fight, and that fight was not over yet. She turned toward the water, her breath catching in her throat as the flood surged higher, surrounding her. The thing beneath the surface was moving closer now, its vast shape coming into focus, the water swirling around it like a vortex. Its presence was suffocating. Its hunger was unimaginable, but it was not invincible. Leah closed her eyes and focused. She could feel it, the storm's pulse, the land's pulse. The valley had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. She had come to this place seeking escape, but now she had to destroy it. She had to break the valley's cycle of hunger, break the storm's grasp on the land before it could consume everything else. The storm raged above, but something was changing. She felt the pressure, the weight of the water shift. Something was weakening. The thing that had always been beneath the land was dying. The valley could not keep it forever. And now Leah had to finish what she had started. Her body shook with the effort, but she didn't stop. She reached down, her fingers slipping beneath the water, and found the stone again. The stone that had always been here, that had been a part of the valley's foundation. She gripped it tight, her mind focused, and then she pulled. A crack of thunder rang out above, deafening, and the flood surged one final time. The valley, the land, the storm, all of it screamed in rage, as if the earth itself was being torn apart. Leah felt the pull of the land, but she held on. She had already fought so long. The stone cracked beneath her grip, and the water recoiled, the storm's fury subsiding just for a moment. And then, for the first time, she felt the earth weaken. The storm, the valley, the thing beneath the flood, they were all slowly, painfully retreating, unraveling. The storm had been banished. The waters began to recede. The sky cleared, and Leah, exhausted, trembling and soaked to the bone, stood on the remnants of the land. Her body was sore, her strength almost gone, but she had done it. She had broken the cycle. The storm had been an echo, a warning. The land was now silent, and in that silence she realized the valley was no longer hungry. It had been freed, but so had she. The world felt different now. The storm had passed, the floodwaters receding with every passing moment, revealing a land that for the first time in what seemed like an eternity was quiet. The wind had stopped howling. The earth was no longer shaking beneath her feet. The trees, their roots soaked and bent, now stood still, like silent sentinels watching over the valley that had claimed so many before her. Leah stood at the edge of the water, her clothes clinging to her body, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. The cold had seeped into her bones, but she barely felt it. The storm that had haunted her, that had twisted everything she had known into a nightmare, was gone. The flood, the twisted figures that had once been her tormentors, the thing beneath the land, it was all gone. For a moment, the valley felt almost peaceful. The soft light of dawn broke through the mist, casting a pale glow across the water's surface, illuminating the wreckage of the cabin, the twisted trees, the scattered remnants of everything that had once been alive. The air was still, the kind of stillness that felt almost unnatural, like the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Leah's eyes scanned the landscape. It was familiar, yet alien, as if the very nature of the valley had changed with the passing of the storm. The land was scarred, but it was still here. She was still here. She had survived. But at what cost? Her gaze drifted to the remains of the cabin. The walls that had once offered refuge now lay shattered, half submerged, its foundation barely visible beneath the debris. The creek that had once seemed so small, so harmless, was now a twisted memory, its waters no longer violent but calm, almost eerily so. She had broken the cycle. The land, the storm, the ancient force that had risen with the flood, it was over, or so she hoped. But there was a feeling deep within her chest that she couldn't shake, a feeling of emptiness, a gnawing ache that had nothing to do with the physical exhaustion that racked her body. No, this was something else, something deeper. The valley had been freed, but at what cost? Riley's face flashed in her mind, his hollow, vacant eyes staring back at her as the flood had taken him, his body lost to the storm. She thought of the other souls, those who had been drawn to this place, those who had been claimed by the flood before her. The figures that had risen from the water, the ones that had tried to drag her under, they were the last remnants of the valley's hunger. They had been lost, absorbed, and now they were gone. But as Leah stood in the stillness, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if they had truly disappeared, or if they were still waiting for someone else, someone like her, someone who would be drawn back to this place. The wind stirred for the first time in hours, a faint whisper, like a breath brushing against her ear. She turned, her heart racing, but there was nothing. The land was silent again. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, grounding herself in the reality of what had happened. The storm had ended. She had broken free. The valley, the flood, the ancient force that had haunted her, they were gone. But as the days stretched on, the questions continued to haunt her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Had she truly broken the cycle, or had she only delayed it? The storm had been defeated, but what if there was more to the valley's hunger than she understood? What if, somehow, it would return, seeking another soul, another victim to drag into its depths? Leah's hands trembled as she knelt beside the remnants of the cabin. The flood had left its mark on everything, but beneath the destruction, she felt the pull of the valley's quiet promise, a promise that, like the storm, was always waiting to rise again. Her eyes caught something in the debris, a small, waterlogged object. She reached down, pulling it from the wreckage, a child's toy, torn and battered by the flood, its colors faded, its once vibrant surface now worn and weathered. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of its past sinking into her bones. The toy, it felt so familiar, so out of place. But where had it come from? Her mind flashed back to the beginning, to the moments before the storm had fully enveloped her. The strange objects washing up near the cabin, the shoe, the doll, the clothing. And now, this toy. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, as realization struck. It wasn't just the valley, it wasn't just the storm. Something had always been here, tied to the land, to the flood, and it was not finished. Leah's throat tightened. She had defeated the storm. She had broken the flood. But the land itself, The force that had called to her was not a force that could be destroyed. It was part of the earth, part of the valley, part of the very cycle of life and death that had existed long before she had arrived, and long after she would leave. A voice in her mind whispered, just like it had before, "Leah, come back to me." She spun around, the toy still clutched in her hand, but the valley was silent. The land was still, the water calm. The storm had passed, the figures had faded, but deep down, Leah knew. The hunger was not truly gone. It was waiting, just beneath the surface, hiding in the shadows of the valley, in the depths of the water, in the cracks of the earth itself. And when the time was right, it would call again. Leah's heart ached with the realization. There would never be true peace here, not for her, not for anyone who dared to venture too close. The storm, the valley's hunger, it was eternal. A cycle that could never truly be broken. She had escaped it, for now. But the valley's pull would always be there. And someday, someone else would hear it. Just as she had. As she turned and walked away, leaving the wreckage behind, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the valley. It was quiet now. The storm was gone. But Leah knew better. The valley's hunger would never end.